Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all be sealed for a new year of health and goodness. A Jewish woman named Bertha was just about to make herself a cup of coffee when her front doorbell rang. She looked through the window and saw that it was a Jehovah's Witness missionary. She thinks to herself, you know, I'm usually pretty rude to these people. Maybe that makes the Jewish people look bad. It's the 10 days of repentance. I think I'll try being decent and kind instead. So she opens the door and smiles warmly. Good morning, ma'am, the man says. I'm a Jehovah's Witness, but before he could continue, Bertha said to him, I'm just about to make myself some coffee. Why don't you come in and join me? Very surprised, he agreed. After coffee, Bertha said, I'm now going to have some lunch for myself. Why don't you join me in a bite to eat, and we can talk about your faith afterwards? The missionary was shocked by Bertha's kindness and decency, especially since she slammed the door in his face the last time. But again, he agreed and sat down for lunch. When they had finished a generous and tasty lunch of cold cuts and soup, Bertha said, okay, I'm all ears. Why don't you start at the very beginning and tell me all about the Jehovah's Witness movement and your beliefs? He was totally floored by the warm and decent treatment that he's received. And he says, ma'am, I can't tell you anything. I've never gotten this far before. Like many rabbis, I have spoken about morality from the pulpit hundreds of times in different permutations. But I think that given what is going on in our country right now, common decency is actually a more important topic than morality right now. And I will explain the difference shortly. First, I'm going to tell you what common decency is and why we should care about it. Then I will explain why we should talk about decency on Yom Kippur. Third, I'll talk about how this lack of basic decency is affecting our society. And finally, what we can do to reverse the problem. If you're not asleep by then, we'll do marriage. What is decency? You might think that decency and morality are synonyms, but there is an important difference between them. Morality primarily concerns our private behavior, what people don't see. Decency, in contrast, is mainly an issue of external conduct, the behavior we display for the world to see. In other words, morality is first and foremost something that God demands of us. Decency, in contrast, is the behavior that we demand of each other, no matter what our personal religious beliefs may be. I didn't make this up, of course. It's in the Torah in Parashat Nitzavim, which we read very recently. This verse actually is at the end of all of the confessions of Yom Kippur as well, where it says, hidden things are for the Lord our God, but public matters are for us and our children forever. That verse means that I or other people can encourage you to be moral, but your morality is ultimately between you and God. Decency, however, is something that is required of all of us, and it is our responsibility as human beings to enforce it. Now that we know what decency is, we can ask why we should care about decency. The answer is that we should care about it because it is one of society's load-bearing columns. A load-bearing column, for those of you who do not know, is a column that supports the weight of a building. If you remove or damage a load-bearing column, your structure could collapse. Decency, the outward respectability we maintain, stabilizes our nation. Along with other weight-bearing columns such as family, the economy, and public safety, decency makes life as we know it possible. Anything that harms one of our load-bearing columns must be condemned in no uncertain terms. If people were not basically decent with each other, we wouldn't be able to form the relationships that make life meaningful. And life is all about the relationships we make. A lack of decency prevents those bonds and connections from forming because it drives people apart and makes them turn away from each other in disgust. Without decency, society unravels. Without decency, in the immortal words of Bill Murray in the original Ghostbusters movie, we would have mass hysteria, dogs and cats living together. When a community becomes indecent, it starts to rot from the inside. The most recent example I can think of is the territory controlled by ISIS, where the fundamentals of basic decency have completely dissolved. We're seeing the same phenomenon in some urban areas in our country that are ruled by gangs. You can think of decency as a kind of filter for society. Legally speaking, we have the right to say pretty much whatever we want, and I support that right. But when needlessly lewd and crude behavior becomes extremely common, that load-bearing column of decency starts to shake and rattle. What causes decency to decline in the first place? That is an easy question. Decency weakens when the standards of public morality are relaxed too much. My dictionary says that decency is behavior that conforms to accepted standards of morality or respectability. So when those standards are weakened or eliminated, the result is indecency. One reason that our standards are going down the toilet is the lack of education about moral truth. According to a New York Times editorial by philosophy professor Justin McBrayer, the National Common Core curriculum teaches students that all value statements are mere opinions. The result, Professor McBrayer says, is that America's college students are often unable to say with certainty that murder for fun is morally wrong. They hem and haw and say, well, I personally think that murder for fun is not a real good idea, but I can't say that it is wrong for all people in all cases. You know what I mean? This is what obsessing about diversity has done to us. It's a terrible trend, and it bodes poorly for the future of American decency. If we can agree on basic moral truths that we all have in common, then there is no standard for decency to rest upon. Decency cannot exist without a consensus, a widely held consensus about simple moral questions. Of course, it's unfair to dump the blame all on the Common Core curriculum, which itself only reflects the politics of the wider society. Maybe a more important source of the problem is that most Americans of all ages know very little about the Bible, the Western world's primary source of moral standards. How many high school seniors and college freshmen can name the 10 Commandments? How many can name them in order? How many of them can find the words, "Love your neighbor as yourself," in the Bible and speak intelligently about its meaning? I am afraid the answer is not very many. If we don't even know what the moral standards are, then there can't be any decency because we will not know how to define it. So we know what decency is. It's the dignified public behavior that we have to display for others, even if we ourselves are not always so great on the inside. We also know why we should care about it. We need to care about decency because it is one of the things that makes civilized life possible. But why should we think about decency on Yom Kippur? I happen to think that any time is a good time to think about decency, but Yom Kippur is a particularly auspicious time to do so. The reason I say that is that Yom Kippur started in biblical days as a ritual for communal atonement. The Torah reading for Yom Kippur, which we will read tomorrow morning, focuses on the ceremony that the high priest performed in order to cleanse the nation of their sins, which were loaded on a goat and sent into the wilderness, the original scapegoat. We need to think about decency on Yom Kippur because indecency is not the doing of any one individual. A single person's indecent behavior, even when it is very shocking and disgusting, is a symptom of indecency in the culture at large. Yom Kippur is all about our communal sins. Even when we talk about our personal sins, we speak about them in the first person plural and atone for them together as a community. That's why we say Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. We are guilty, we have betrayed, we have stolen. And that's why we say Al Chet Shechatanu, for the sin we have committed. Indecency is a communal sin. To borrow a phrase from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Don't get me wrong, we should be deeply concerned about any individual's indecent behavior, especially if the person in question wants power or influence or an important job. At the same time, we must also worry about the communal lack of decency that generates and fuels the individual kind, allowing it to spread and thrive like a spiritual infection. Yom Kippur is a time for us to atone for the indecency in our society as a whole, and there is a lot of it. How has this lack of decency affected our nation? There are several kinds of indecency, too many for me to discuss today, and they are all chipping away like termites at that load-bearing column I was talking about. One in particular that demands our attention is the obvious kind, the kind that we're all talking about right now, which is sexual indecency. This form of indecency is wrong because it reduces men to animals and women to objects. I fear that our young men are learning some very toxic lessons about women. That is why we had the case of Brock Turner, the Stanford University rapist, who, to my shock and dismay, only served 3 months in jail. As if it weren't bad enough that his victim was raped, what I found so deeply sickening about this case is that the crime was committed in public. Brock Turner was apprehended by some bicyclists who rode by and saw him assaulting his victim in broad daylight. There was no question about what he did. Who or what taught Brock that it was okay to treat a woman in this manner? And as a result of his unbelievably lenient sentence, how many other young men learned a toxic lesson of their own? When powerful people commit acts of sexual indecency, they must be punished. If for no other reason, then at least as an example for the rest of us. Here in America, we tend to believe that powerful people can do whatever they please, and unfortunately, that is often quite true. But it's not true in Israel. Israel takes sexual indecency very, very seriously. Their former president, Moshe Katsav, was convicted of rape, and he was sentenced to prison just as anyone else would have been. When Israel Defense Force Colonel Ataf Zahar raped a subordinate, he also was sent to prison. Moreover, he was forced to pay his victim the equivalent of $10,000 and his rank was reduced to private. In Israel, perhaps because it is a place where Jewish values matter, at least in theory, power does not allow you to do whatever you want. Sexual indecency should not be ignored because it turns a fundamental relationship into a power-based dynamic of predator versus prey. And that is not what we are supposed to do. There's a story from the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin that shows what the Jewish tradition thinks of this kind of indecency. There was once a man who became very attracted to a certain woman. She refused to marry him, but his attraction did not go away. In fact, his desire for this woman only deepened, and he drove himself crazy to the point that he was in physical danger himself. He went to the doctor, and the doctor said that the only thing that would cure him would be for the woman to submit to him. The sages banned the doctor's prescription and said, "We would rather that this man die than that the woman submit to him." So the doctor changed his prescription. This time he said that the man would be cured if he were allowed to look at the woman's naked body. Again, the sages forbade the doctor's advice and said, "It is better that the man die than he be allowed to gaze at the woman's naked body." Finally, the doctor changed his orders again and said that the man would be cured if he would just be allowed to talk to the woman through a screen. Even so, the sages said, "We would rather that this man die than he talk to her through a screen." The moral of the story is that sexual indecency cannot be tolerated, even if it would save a life. This woman wanted nothing to do with this man, so that should have been the end of the story. The Talmud does not tell us whether or not the man ended up dying. One can only hope that he learned to respect women as a Jewish obligation. A second form of indecency that is eating away at us is profanity. There is so much profanity in our society that I am almost numb to it, and I think many of you agree with me. The issue as I see it is not the bad words we say when we stub a toe. I'm not saying that when you hurt yourself you have to say, "Aw, shucks, Jimmy G. Willikers." And I don't care about humorous profanity in the movies and TV. Let's face it, that kind of humor is funny. Immature and low class, but funny. No, my concern is what the Mahzor calls tum'at sfatayim, impurity of the lips. The kind of machine gun potty mouth that is just indiscriminately sprayed everywhere these days. The problem with such profanity is that it desecrates the human capacity for communication, a divine gift that ought to be treated with the utmost of respect. Our power of speech can be used for both beauty and ugliness, which is why the Bible says in Proverbs that life and death are in the hands of the tongue. Of course, you don't have to use your mouth to be profane. The National Football League just increased the penalties for the offense of unsportsmanlike behavior. It seems that many of the players were using their backsides to make deeply offensive gestures to taunt the opposing side in the end zone. You might say that their backsides were offsides. You could ask Giants wide receiver Odell Beckham, who was fined $24,000 for obscene behavior during a recent loss against the Vikings. The Talmud condemns profanity in no uncertain terms. In Tractate Shabbat, page 33a, Rabbi Hanan, the son of Rabbah, taught the following: "Everyone knows what the bride and groom do after a wedding, but anybody who defiles his mouth by talking about it is cursed for 70 years, even if he had just been sealed into the book of life for 70 years. There again, we see the connection between indecency and Yom Kippur. Profanity can ruin all the good we do for ourselves in these 10 days and beyond. If you pray your heart out and ask for forgiveness here, make sure you don't flush it away when you leave the building by defiling your mouth with disgusting language. What can we do to protect and restore the decency of our society? Well, the first step is to take the problem seriously. Back in 1959, a man named G. Clifford Prout appeared on a relatively new program called The Today Show. And he announced the creation of a new organization called SINA, the Society for Indecency of Naked Animals. Mr. Prout claimed that animals needed pants to cover their behinds just like humans, and that it was indecent to allow animals to walk around naked. I guess it was a more gullible, maybe a more innocent time back then, but everybody believed what Mr. Prout was saying. They took it seriously. He had membership cards and all the paraphernalia of a real organization. It turned out to be a giant hoax perpetrated by comedian Alan Abel. He played an awesome joke on America, and we fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. But indecency is not a joke anymore, and we need to take the problem seriously, just as seriously as we take other societal issues. The other thing we can do is protest against indecency in whatever way we can. Vote in the way that you think will protect decency in America. Vote however you want, but please keep the issue of decency in your mind when you do so. When we hear indecency, especially from the mouths of children, we have to stand up and say that it's wrong, even if doing so makes us look like old fuddy-duddies. The best parents are the ones who are not cool. But the most important thing you can do is embed the value of decency into your life. Live a decent life. Be an example of a decent life, and then you won't have to protest very loudly at all. Your life will become a powerful statement against the obscenity that endangers our country. May we all earn our seal in the book of life by standing up for decency and fighting indecency whenever and wherever we can. Gemar Tov. It's now my pleasure to invite our president, Mark Hilton, to deliver his annual message to the congregation.